Hello for the final time this semester. A couple of quick announcements and reminders. One is that if you have not done your student evaluation of this course and other journalism courses, we'd appreciate it if you could get those done as quickly as possible. As you know, it's online and only takes about 3 minutes, and we do regard them seriously, so I would appreciate that. Second, if you have any questions about spring courses or looking farther ahead, please get in touch with me at your convenience. I'm sort of the principal advisor, though you're free to talk to other journalism faculty. And the third thing is that I want to reiterate my intention of getting the grading done and submitted before the holidays, so that requires timely submission of your papers. If you're having a problem with that, please be in touch and let me know, and we'll see what we can work out. The topic for this week is journalistic coverage of the environment and energy. And here, once again, this is a very complex global topic to which you could devote an entire course. And in fact, we have a course called Environmental Reporting, JRN 3800, that we offer once a year. It's generally taught by Professor Christopher Hallowell, who's written several books on the environment. And I think it's a really good course if you're particularly interested in the topic. There's so much in the news about climate change and what can be done and the failure to get things done and the international cooperation to move forward and the lack of cooperation and so on, that I decided I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that today, and rather I just want to focus on climate change in New York City, where perhaps the effects and the potential effects are less visible, or something we think about less than when we think about the rainforest or the terrible wildfires burning out west and in Russia. But climate change is real, and it is already affecting New York City and will continue to. And since I believe most of you are intending to stay in the New York area, you should just have these things on your mind. You should see how well they're covered in the news media, and if you're looking for material to write about, I think this is a fruitful beat. So let me just go over a few points. I think today's discussion will be will be a little shorter than usual. The first is there's definitely been an increase in warmer temperatures since 1970, which to me feels like yesterday, but of course it was 50 years ago. In that time, the average annual temperature has risen 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit. This is true all through New York City. It's true all through New York State, and it's most severe in northern New York State. If you're familiar with the geography of New York State, if you go due north, it's about 350 miles to the Canadian border and to Montreal, which is very close to the border. And that area, the northern part of the state, is generally the coldest part of the state, and it has been warming most dramatically. Another aspect of global warming in New York City has been there is a significant increase in precipitation. In the last century, the numbers are up markedly, and perhaps peculiarly in the last 20 years, New York is getting more rain and snow in the winter and less rain in the summer. Drier summers, wetter winters. And this is a characteristic of warming climates. So, for instance, an area like Seattle and the west coast of Washington and Oregon are warmed by Pacific currents, and except in the mountains get very little snow, but an enormous amount of rainfall. And we're starting to see similar effects on this side of the country. we're not only getting more precipitation annually, but we're getting more severe storm events. The specific rainfalls tend to be heavier, and there are lots of problems with this. There's flooding streets and roadways. There's overwhelming and flooding of storm sewers. There's damage to homes. And taken all together, there's significant property damage every year just from this increased precipitation. We're also, as other parts of the country and the world are, experiencing a rise in the sea level. There are parts of New York where maybe we don't think about the sea so much, but of course New York Harbor is one of the world's great harbors, and we are adjacent to the Atlantic Ocean. And what we're seeing is that in the last century, sea levels have risen more than a foot. Now that's a pretty striking number, and it's comparable to some of what has gone on in Florida and been written about a great deal. And the expectation is that in the next several decades, sea levels will rise another 18 to 50 inches. So what does this mean? Well, it means you have beach erosion where there are beaches. You have more flooding of communities that are very close to the ocean and the harbor. You have a resulting instability in homes that are built along the water and in roadways that are built along the water. You have damage to vegetation and the soil, and the effects are potentially enormous. And that's even without contemplating the awful specter of hurricanes and superstorms like Sandy, which, as you know, did hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars of damage, some of which has still not been restored. Some of the homes that were, completely destroyed. One problem with this sea rise is that it tends to be locked in for centuries. It's not very quickly reversible because the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere trap heat. They're already in the atmosphere trapping heat. And it's not to say they're irreversible, but they are irreversible until humanity does something meaningful about emissions. And while there's progress on some fronts and agreements on others, both globally and in the United States, there's a lot of reluctance to tackle this truly aggressively. And I think President Biden has made a commitment to do this, but of course he doesn't have autocratic powers and will need the cooperation of Congress, and it generally will need support of the public, and that support has not been fully mustered and demonstrated yet, possibly because the leadership in the U.S. has not been fierce advocates for it. But it would require great changes in vehicle use, in vehicle power. And, just to think about New York for a minute, we're in this, I don't want to call it a death cycle, but we're in a very desperate time around public transportation, where the MTA is saying that it's losing so much money that it's going to have to cut service, maybe as much as 40% of service, particularly targeting bus lines, but some of the subway lines as well. Fewer trains, more crowding, longer waits, and all of this taken together has the impact of pushing more people into vehicles and abandoning public transportation. So, it's obviously the exact opposite of what you want to do from an environmental point of view. And that leads to increased traffic, increased air pollution, increased noise, loss of productivity from time stuck in traffic. So it's a dramatic reversal of what progress has been made, and we'll just have to see what happens next. It's just not clear. aside from all the uncertainty about the budget and how effective the new U.S. administration will be, there is a mayoral election next fall. And we don't know who the mayor will be. We don't know what that person's policies will be. We don't know how much freedom the mayor will have to execute policies without New York State. And so there are levels of cooperation involving the public and leadership and different leaderships. And there's a lot to be worked out, but it's hard to be optimistic and say we're moving in the right direction. We will just have to see. It's important to keep in mind that when decisions are made about energy, land use, infrastructure, these are long-lasting decisions. And so even though for most of you, you're not at a point in your lives where you're thinking about your children and grandchildren, I am. And, we're shaping a world that's going to affect the next generations of our families, and to a large extent we're not shaping it well. So that's something to think about. Another area where the New York City region is affected by climate change is in natural resources. I mean, one example is spring now comes earlier, not of course, the official date on the calendar, but we see it in the vegetation. Leaves are blooming and repopulating the trees more than a week earlier than they were a few decades ago. Flowers are blooming earlier. Another broad way of expressing this thought is that the winter snow cover is decreasing, and to the extent that packs in and preserves heat and protects the earth underneath, we are all more vulnerable. Another sign of these earlier springs is that pollinating bees are arriving much earlier, more than a week earlier than they had previously. So this is just another symptom of the climate change that we see. We're also, people who follow it also see significant changes in the bird migrations, breeding birds, and the population of oceanic fish, which are still fished in the New York area. There's still several major fishing fleets. One is in Sheepshead Bay in Brooklyn, another is in City Island off the Bronx coast near the Connecticut border. And we're seeing different fish. The populations of fish are shifting. Some fish are migrating north, seeking cooler waters. We see this in the southern hemisphere as well, where various populations of fish are moving. And to the extent that there are populations that are very dependent on fish, these can be very dramatic changes to availability of food and of diet. We also need to think about climate change in the New York area in terms of some of the health risks it poses. For people who work outdoors, the warming climate is potentially more dangerous over a period of time. There's evidence that shows that areas that are experiencing significant warming also have an increase in mental illness. Some of the changes I'm describing are bringing with them a great deal of stress, whether it's the stress of dealing with the storm, the stress of dealing with flooding that interferes with your ability to get to work, the need to make changes in your home or apartment because of warmer weather or more frequent storms or heavier storms. All of this is very stressful, and that takes a toll on humans as well. We're also seeing an increase in what I will call weather events that are health hazards. One that you're familiar with is heat waves. And heat waves, of course, can cause a great many illnesses: heat stroke, exhaustion. People who are already sick, who have heart or lung diseases or other chronic conditions, are particularly affected. Shifts in the climate and the temperature of the climate, warmer temperatures, can also expand the range of disease-carrying insects, bringing with them diseases that are rare and now are becoming more common in the area. We're also seeing an increase in pollen production, and that causes problems from people who have asthma. There are infectious diseases transmitted by insect bites and by tick bites, and there's been a huge surge in the New York area and its suburbs of ticks, which can carry Lyme disease. We now are finding ticks and mosquitoes in areas where they were uncommon, and this is a real hazard. The changing patterns of precipitation also have an impact on drought and flooding. New York draws its water supply from reservoirs that are upstate. I mean, some of them are close at hand. There's one in Westchester, and some are farther upstate. But if there's drought or if there's flooding, it can reflect the availability of water. New York has been buffered by that excellent reservoir system compared with some other major cities, but it's certainly potentially a problem. And flooding and increased rainfall can also result in a great deal of dampness in homes, schools, workplaces. Dampness is very destructive. It brings with it mold. The mold can carry disease. And maybe these are things we don't think about so much in New York City, but it's here and it's getting worse, and it needs some attention. Another effect, which is more indirect, is that some of these weather events and changes can be very disruptive to the food supply, and can interfere or ruin harvests, reduce the supply of food. It can change growing conditions and storage conditions. It can affect grain. It can affect cattle. It affects chicken production. And so all of these things that we consume and that are part of our lives, but maybe we don't think about all that much, are getting worse and have the potential to get a great deal worse. So you really need to see more consciousness of this, which I think most of you have. I think your generation is quite knowledgeable and concerned about this, but maybe not so much uneducated people, not so much older people. And so what we really need is sort of an organized social outcry that gives birth to social action that aggressively takes steps to address climate change. There are things we can do here in New York City. Better roadways, dealing with flooding is one thing, but probably the single biggest thing is coming up with ways to regulate traffic. And as I said earlier today, the single greatest component of that is having effective public service, public transit. And I think that those cities that have it, and just to pull one out of the air, Paris, I think, has a very good public transit system. I believe Moscow does as well. You don't have this desperate need of so many people to drive their cars to work. I'm one of the culprits. When I come to school, I usually drive because where I live, the train service is only once an hour. And I hate that feeling of missing a train by 5 minutes and having to wait an hour. to get home after an evening class. I also like to be alone in the car so I can listen to music really loud, which annoys my family when I try to do it at home. But I think that to persuade people like me not to take their car, you need to have efficient, safe public transit. And certainly it would help if it was affordable as well. And if you add all of that together, how do you get that? Public spending, public subsidies, and the New York City area's needs are so great that it's really more than the local tax base can sustain. So it needs federal help and recognition that New York City is the center of the financial industry, the media businesses, the advertising industry, the banking industry, the arts. I don't have to go on and on, but you get the idea that clearly should be a national interest in making New York City and the New York City area strong and vibrant and safer. And that requires vision and commitment. And it's sort of been absent for years. And we've also had, I'm not going to go into detail here, but this very bizarre feuding between our governor, our mayor, who really need to be partners and have to cooperate to make things happen, all the different things I'm addressing, but particularly transit and other environmental issues. And, that might require a change of leadership as well. Well, we're going to get one in New York City. We'll see how that person gets along with the governor. So this is sort of a negative note to end this course on. I think the journalism coverage of the environment is pretty good. I think there are a lot of specialists now who cover it very well. I think this is true at the big national news organizations, and I think it's also true at some small startups and websites. 3 or 4 years ago, there was a startup website based in Brooklyn called Inside Climate Change, and it did wonderful work, and it won a Pulitzer Prize. It was the first small website ever to win a Pulitzer Prize. So I think there's appetite for this coverage. I think there's passion among the people doing it. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there for those of you who are interested in it. But this is one area where I look at news coverage and think it's pretty good. Let me just end by saying that I hope you feel this course has been worthwhile. It's the first asynchronous course I've taught, and I see some of the virtues in the flexibility it affords all of you, but it's very frustrating to me not to get to meet students and get to know them. And I've had conferences with those of you who've asked, and some of you are students from other classes, and that's been great. I think we'll be living with this system for a while, certainly through the spring and into the summer. And what will happen in the fall, I think, will be largely dependent on what happens with vaccines. So I hope it all works out. I hope if you're still in school next year, you will come by and introduce yourselves. I'm around. I'm happy to talk on the phone. I'm happy to set up Zoom meetings. And I hope this course has been worth the time that you've put into it. I'll just say that, and I hope you will do evaluations that will let me know what worked and what didn't work. I wish you all the best for a successful end of the semester and for whatever holidays you observe, and for a happier and more peaceful and less chaotic new year. So thank you very much.